August 15th, 1945. The day Japan's emperor announced surrender crackled across radios in Tokyo, but in the bamboo-framed huts of Luzon, in the shadows of Burma's jungles, and in the cellars of Nanjing, the war did not feel over. In one such station, deep in the Philippines, the air reeked of mildew and sweat. Thin paper screens rattled in the humid wind, and a group of young women, some barely out of girlhood, sat in silence, clutching one another like driftwood in a storm. They did not know what the date meant. They only knew the sounds of boots, the bark of Japanese sergeants, the gnawing ache in their stomachs, and the way time had shrunk to a single expectation. More soldiers, more nights, more survival. The place had been called a comfort station, a phrase that sounded almost merciful in its vagueness. In truth, it was a prison without bars. The Japanese Imperial Army had built such sites wherever its flag spread: Shanghai, Manila, Rangoon, Seoul. The estimates later given to historians varied wildly. Some said 50,000 women had been taken. Others argued it was closer to 200,000. Numbers that could fill stadiums were reduced here to shadows behind reed mats, waiting for the next order. One of the women, 17 years old, bit her lip so hard it bled. She had been taken from her Korean village 2 years earlier, told she would work in a factory for the empire. Instead, she had been placed on a transport ship, then herded into this station. Her name, like so many others, had been stripped away and replaced with a number on a ledger. She would later say that her greatest fear was not dying, but forgetting the sound of her mother's voice. Tonight, she whispered fragments of lullabies in her own tongue, barely audible above the drone of cicadas. Nearby sat a Filipino woman, older perhaps 23, though malnutrition carved years into her skin. She had been captured after the Japanese swept through her village in 1942. She remembered hiding in the tall grass with her younger brother until the bayonet tips flashed above them. He had been killed on the spot. She had been taken. Now her body was a ledger entry, her memories the only thing left unrecorded. She kept her eyes fixed on the floorboards, for she had learned that eye contact, whether with Japanese guards or fellow captives, invited danger. The women had been conditioned into silence. Rules were shouted in Japanese: obedience, cleanliness, availability. Doctors came once a week for inspections that left the women sore and humiliated. Soldiers filed in by the dozen. On long nights, each woman endured 20 or more visits. Disease spread quickly, but refusal was unthinkable. They lived in the paradox of surviving the war, yet feeling every day like its most expendable casualties. Outside, the war was indeed shifting. American bombers had rained fire on Tokyo. The atomic mushroom clouds had risen over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Emperor Hirohito's surrender speech would soon signal the collapse of an empire. But in these hidden rooms, there were no radios, no celebrations, no knowledge of history turning. Only the creak of doors, the hiss of lamps, and the dread that another set of boots would scrape against the threshold. The Japanese guards had fled days earlier, abandoning their posts when defeat became inevitable. Yet the women did not feel liberated. Abandonment did not equal freedom. It meant exposure. If Japanese soldiers no longer controlled them, who would? Perhaps worse men? Perhaps enemies even more ruthless. Rumors drifted through like smoke. Americans were near. For women who had endured years of being used by one army, the thought of another army filled them with terror. Soldiers were soldiers. Uniforms, no matter their color, meant power over the powerless. One woman whispered that Americans were tall giants who smoked cigars and shot first, laughed later. Another said she had heard from a Japanese officer that the Americans were even more barbaric, that they would defile any woman they found. The irony, of course, was bitter. They were already living through what their enemies accused others of. But fear does not measure irony. It measures survival. The hut grew still at dusk. Shadows stretched long over the cracked floorboards. They huddled together, the younger ones clutching the older clutching no one. Outside, the rumble of engines approached. Boots, this time heavier, unfamiliar in rhythm, began to echo. The cicadas faltered, as if the jungle itself were holding its breath. Inside, the Korean girl pressed her nails into her palms until crescents of blood bloomed. She thought of her mother, of a market stall by the river, of roasted chestnuts and the smell of soap. She thought, too, of the endless hands of soldiers, and she prepared herself for more. She knew the steps by heart: look down, endure, survive. She braced for the routine that had erased her humanity and turned her body into a passageway for war. The door slid open. Silhouettes filled the frame, broad shoulders outlined against the fading light. The women recoiled instinctively, pulling shawls tight around bony arms, eyes wide and unblinking. The figures stepped inside, carrying something bulky, something square. The women did not yet understand that they were not boxes of ammunition, but crates of food. The men were not barking orders in clipped Japanese, but murmuring in English, their accents rough, almost musical compared to the harsh syllables they knew. But in that first instant, none of the women could hear difference in tone or language. They only saw uniforms. Uniforms meant ownership. Uniforms meant terror. Their breath quickened, bodies rigid, awaiting the familiar cycle of command and violation. The Americans paused, uncertain at the sight of hollow-eyed women cowering on the floor. They set down their crates with deliberate slowness, like men trying not to spook wild deer. One GI pulled a tin from his pocket, shaking it gently. It rattled with the sound of canned peaches. Another held out a bar of soap as if it were a peace offering. The women did not move. Their minds could not reconcile what their eyes saw. Food? Soap? Offers? These were the tricks soldiers used before cruelty. And yet the Americans kept their distance, speaking words the women did not understand but whose cadence carried no menace. For now it was only confusion. The women sat frozen, blood pounding in their ears, as the strange men with tired eyes and sunburned skin did not lunge, did not shout, did not reach. Something was wrong, something was different. And in that suspended silence, one truth became clear: the war had ended. But what was about to begin would be even more shocking. The Americans stood awkwardly at the threshold, their rifles slung at their sides, boots still caked with jungle mud. Their eyes adjusted to the dim interior, and for a moment neither side moved. The women huddled together like sparrows under a predator's shadow, their gazes fixed on the floor, breaths shallow. The soldiers could not have known the layers of fear they were stepping into. The women could not have guessed that these men, exhausted and half-starved themselves, had come bearing something closer to mercy than conquest. One GI bent down and pried open a crate. The crack of splintering wood made the women flinch, but inside there was no ammunition. Instead, tins gleamed under the lantern light. He held one up, turning it slowly so the women could see the label: bright peaches sealed in syrup. The sweet smell had not yet escaped, but for women who had survived on watery rice and scraps, the sight alone seemed impossible. Another soldier rummaged in his pack and produced cigarettes, offering them like tokens of goodwill. He did not know that many of the women had never smoked, that the gesture reminded them of Japanese officers who had forced such things between their lips. The silence thickened until one man, tall and red-haired, attempted to mime eating. He tapped the tin with his knife, made a spooning motion toward his mouth, and grinned with the nervous smile of someone who knows he looks foolish. For the first time in months, maybe years, a flicker of something not fear but confusion passed across a woman's face. She almost laughed, almost, but the habit of silence clenched her throat shut. In that strange standoff, the Americans seemed more bewildered than threatening. Their eyes softened as they took in the sight: hollow cheeks, arms covered in bruises, hair cut unevenly by months of rough handling. They whispered among themselves, a tone the women did not understand but could sense was gentler than the bark of orders. One soldier muttered, "My God, they're just girls." Another shook his head, muttering curses under his breath at what he was seeing. Finally, the youngest of the women, perhaps 15, reached forward with trembling hands. She expected the blow to come, the barked insult, the punishment for presuming. Instead, the soldier placed the tin gently into her palms. She drew back instantly, clutching it to her chest as if it were contraband, her eyes darting from the can to the man's face. He did not move closer. He simply nodded, once, firmly, then stepped back. The moment rippled through the group. Others glanced at each other, hesitant. Then the older Filipina woman stretched out her arm, fingers thin and shaking, toward the soap one soldier still held. He placed it in her hand without a word. She pressed it to her face, inhaling the clean scent, and tears slid down her cheeks. Soap, a thing so ordinary it rarely merited notice, had become more precious than gold. The Americans set down more supplies: bandages, quinine tablets, powdered milk. The women stared, disbelief etched into their faces. None of this fit the script they had been forced to memorize. Soldiers did not give. Soldiers only took. Yet here were men who offered, then stepped back, as though aware of the invisible boundaries carved by trauma. Outside, the sounds of other squads echoed through the village. Engines rumbled, shouts carried. But inside this hut, the air held still, suspended in fragile equilibrium. The Americans tried to speak, gesturing with open hands. The women remained wary, shoulders stiff, eyes flickering between the door and the floor. The instincts of survival told them this kindness might be a trap, that the cruelty would come later when their guard lowered. But then something almost absurd happened. The red-haired GI pulled from his pack not more food, but a small harmonica. He pressed it to his lips and began to play. A clumsy tune, notes bending, not quite in rhythm. The sound startled everyone, even his comrades. Yet in that strange moment, the hut filled with something neither side expected: music. It was cracked and imperfect, but it was not shouted commands. It was not boots pounding or fists slamming. It was, astonishingly, play. The women's eyes widened. One covered her mouth as if afraid laughter might escape. Another tilted her head, tears mixing with a small, incredulous smile. The Americans chuckled at their friends' fumbling, the laughter not sharp but warm, and the tension loosened just slightly. For the women, it was perhaps the first moment in years when the presence of soldiers did not mean terror. Still, the fear did not dissolve overnight. When the GIs tried to coax them outside, some refused, convinced danger waited beyond. Even when medics arrived with stretchers to take the sick, women clutched one another, begging not to be separated. The Americans, bewildered by this intensity of fear, began to realize the depth of the wounds left behind. A doctor later recorded that the women showed signs of psychic shock, a phrase inadequate to describe the years of systematic violation that had shaped their instincts. Yet slowly, day by day, gestures built trust. A soldier kneeling to lace a woman's torn sandal instead of demanding her body. Another sitting nearby, carving a piece of wood into the shape of a bird, then leaving it at her feet without asking for anything in return. These acts, small and almost awkward, became a language of their own. They told the women, "Not this time, not us, not ever." The contrast could not have been sharper. Under Japanese officers, medical checks were weekly humiliations. Under the Americans, real doctors treated their infections, wrapped their wounds, and looked them in the eye. For women accustomed to being handled like livestock, that simple act, eye contact without possession, was more bewildering than any weapon. And yet, doubt lingered. At night, some still braced when footsteps approached, hearts pounding until the steps passed. Others hoarded the food given to them, hiding tins of peaches under floorboards, unable to believe abundance could last. Kindness, after so much cruelty, felt like another trick of war. One survivor later recalled the surreal moment she tasted her first bite of canned peaches. The syrup clung to her lips, the sweetness overwhelming after years of hunger. She wept, not just for the taste, but for the strangeness of realizing someone wanted her to eat, not be eaten. For her, that spoonful was more than fruit. It was proof the world had not ended with cruelty. The Americans, for their part, rarely spoke of these encounters. For them, it was one episode among many in a brutal campaign. But for the women, it was the crack in a wall they thought unbreakable. Mercy, offered by strangers in dusty uniforms, forced them to reimagine what men could be. Still, mercy was fragile. Not all Americans were saints, and the women knew that danger lurked in every uniform, even friendly ones. Yet in those first days of liberation, when soap was pressed into their hands and syrup touched their tongues, something undeniable shifted. The war had not erased their humanity after all. But as the days wore on, another question began to rise. If mercy could exist here, in the ashes of war, what would the world beyond these huts demand of them? And what they learned next would prove even harder to endure than captivity itself. History, when written in ledgers and reports, tends to measure suffering in columns. 50,000, 100,000. Some scholars, looking across Asia, raise the figure even higher. Closer to 200,000 women pulled into the system the Japanese military called Ianfu. Each digit was a body, a voice, a girl with a name erased and replaced by a number. Yet behind those statistics lay testimonies that, once spoken, carried the raw weight of truth no chart could hold. In 1991, decades after liberation, a Korean woman named Kim Hak-sun broke her silence. She stood before cameras, her voice trembling, and told the world she had been taken at age 17. Her account was one of the first to pierce the silence that had stretched like a shroud over survivors. "We were treated as less than animals," she said, her words cutting through the numbness of official records. For every Kim Hak-sun, there were thousands who never spoke, some out of shame, others because their voices had been buried by time. But the resonance of one testimony can illuminate the truths of many. American military documents lend a colder, clinical confirmation. The U.S. Army's Psychological Warfare Unit, interviewing liberated captives, recorded notes about comfort stations in Burma, the Philippines, and China. Reports listed venereal disease rates, pregnancies terminated under force, and the staggering daily demands placed on each woman, 15 to 30 soldiers per day, sometimes more. Doctors calculated infection percentages like accountants tallying interest. The language was technical, but the reality behind it could not be sterilized. Numbers in this context became another language of pain. In a hut in Manila, a Filipina woman later told investigators she had been forced to service soldiers until her body gave out, collapsing unconscious only to be beaten awake. She remembered the boots more than the faces. "They never looked at us," she said. "We were like walls, like objects." Decades later, she still remembered the sound of coins clinking into a box outside her door, payment made not to her, but to the system that owned her. The detail chilled even hardened historians. Money changed hands, but none of it touched the palms that bled. The statistics paint cruelty on a massive scale. A 1944 Allied report estimated that 80 to 90% of comfort women were Korean. Others were Chinese, Taiwanese, Filipino, Dutch, Indonesian. Nationality did not spare them. Youth was no protection either. Survivors recalled being as young as 13 when first taken. These numbers do not soften with repetition. They grow heavier because each figure demands recognition as a singular human life interrupted. Against this backdrop, the behavior of American soldiers upon liberation appears even more startling. Bound by the Articles of War, U.S. troops faced strict prohibitions against rape. Not all abided by those laws, for no army is spotless. But in the comfort stations, they encountered something that froze even hardened veterans, a system so organized, so brutal that it defied the imagination of men who had stormed beaches under fire. Many were disgusted, even ashamed that humans could engineer such cruelty. "We thought we had seen hell," one medic later recalled, "but then we walked into those rooms. The contrast was stark. Japanese soldiers had reduced women to schedules, demanding efficiency and exploitation. American soldiers, stumbling into the same huts, responded with shock and often clumsy compassion. They offered what they had: soap, cigarettes, Spam, laughter that was awkward but unthreatening. It was not perfect mercy, but it was mercy nonetheless, and to women who had forgotten such a thing existed, it was disorienting. One survivor recalled, "I thought at first they wanted to fatten us before killing us, but then I realized they wanted us to live." Numbers alone could never convey the sensory dissonance of that moment. Imagine a woman accustomed to the sour stench of sweat and blood suddenly inhaling the clean, sharp scent of soap. A girl who had known only fists pressing against her skin, feeling instead the cold curve of a spoon delivering peaches drenched in syrup. The taste was so sweet it burned, a reminder that the human body was still capable of pleasure unchained from violence. That is the paradox of war. Where brutality reaches its worst, even the smallest kindness becomes almost unbearable. Yet mistrust lingered. When Americans tried to separate the sick for treatment, some women clung to one another, screaming, certain they were being divided for fresh abuse. Army doctors described their condition as psychological trauma of the highest order. The women had no vocabulary for it then, but today we would call it post-traumatic stress. Their fear was not irrational. It was the product of thousands of days when fear had been the only rational response. Still, fragile transformations emerged. In one case, a Korean girl too weak to walk was carried by 2 soldiers on a stretcher. She wept the entire way, not because of pain, but because no man had ever touched her without violence. The gesture of being lifted instead of shoved was so alien it felt like a miracle. Another woman, holding a bandage in her hands, stared at it as if it were a jewel. She later said it was the first time cloth had touched her skin without tearing it. American medics recorded the medical toll in blunt figures: malnutrition in 70% of rescued women, venereal infections in more than half, scarring in nearly all. These numbers shocked commanders who had measured the war in bombs dropped and ships sunk. Here, the casualties were not soldiers, but civilians forced into silence. The contrast was not lost on observers. A Japanese officer once rationalized the system by saying it maintained discipline among the troops. To Allied soldiers, that same system revealed the very absence of discipline, a moral collapse masquerading as order. Irony threaded through the testimonies. One American GI joked that the women ate better once freed than the soldiers themselves. His remark, though clumsy, underscored a strange truth. Cans of peaches, powdered milk, and army biscuits became symbols of liberation. The sweetness of sugar contrasted with the bitterness of memory. For many survivors, those tastes lingered longer than the faces of the men who delivered them. And yet, behind every statistic and testimony lies an unanswerable question. How do you measure dignity returned, even in fragments? If one survivor's tears at the smell of soap could be written as data, what column would it fall under? If another's first laugh in years could be graphed, what axis could hold it? History counts bodies, but it struggles to count humanity. The women carried these contradictions into their futures. Some never spoke of their ordeal, burying it beneath decades of silence. Others, braver or more desperate, testified later, forcing governments to reckon with what had been done. Their voices, cracked with age, still carried the disbelief of that first liberation. "I thought all soldiers were the same," one said. "But those Americans, they did not even touch us." The line became refrain, echo, warning, and revelation. Because if mercy could arrive in the form of dirty, exhausted men carrying soap and peaches, what else might the world hold beyond the boundaries of fear? The answer was uncertain, and for many survivors, what came after liberation proved no less complex than captivity. The war ended, but liberation did not mean peace. When the Americans withdrew and the dust of occupation settled, the women who had been freed from the comfort stations faced a silence as suffocating as captivity. For many, the shock of not being touched by American soldiers was only the beginning of a longer, more complicated reckoning. Mercy had come in unexpected uniforms, yet the world beyond the bamboo walls was not ready to accept them as survivors. It often branded them as shameful reminders of what had been endured. Some returned to their villages only to find doors closed. Families, crushed by poverty and fear, did not welcome daughters who carried the stain of the Japanese Empire. A Korean woman recalled walking home after liberation, her body still weak, her hair unevenly hacked short by soldiers years before. She expected an embrace, but her mother turned away, whispering that neighbors would talk. "I was alive," she said years later. "But in their eyes, I was already ruined." That word, ruined, followed countless women across borders and decades, heavy as a shackle. In the Philippines, one survivor attempted to resume life by working in a market, selling fruit in the very stalls where she had once walked as a child. But whispers trailed her footsteps. Men eyed her differently, women crossed the street, children mimicked insults they did not fully understand. She stopped speaking of the Americans who had spared her, for even kindness became a reminder of what she had survived. In a society eager to rebuild, there was no place for those whose existence testified to wounds that could not be rebuilt with bricks. Yet not all voices disappeared. The testimony of survivors, though delayed, began to carve out space in history. Decades later, when women like Kim Hak-sun spoke publicly, their words echoed the astonishment of that first moment of liberation. They remembered soap and peaches, not as luxuries, but as symbols of a humanity returned. "They did not even touch us," she said, her voice carrying equal parts relief and disbelief. For her, the restraint of the Americans had been as transformative as any weapon of war. It suggested that the cycle of abuse was not inevitable, that there could be soldiers who fought without consuming the bodies of the vulnerable. Historians pieced together these fragments with official records. Reports from General MacArthur's headquarters noted the existence of comfort stations. U.S. medics cataloged venereal infections and malnutrition. Red Cross observers described the haunted stares of rescued women. These documents confirmed what survivors had whispered for decades. The Japanese system had been vast, deliberate, and devastating. But the documents could not capture the contradictions. The way some women described Americans as saviors, while others remembered them as strangers, whose presence reignited their fear. Liberation was not uniform. It was as fractured as the lives it touched. The irony of post-war justice added another layer. At the Tokyo War crimes trials, prosecutors mentioned the comfort women system only in passing. The tribunal focused on aggressive war and atrocities like the Nanjing massacre. For the survivors, their ordeal became a footnote in the greater theater of international justice. Few Japanese officers were ever punished specifically for running the stations. The women waited for acknowledgement that rarely came. For them, the Americans' refusal to touch them in 1945 was a mercy. The world's refusal to remember them afterward was another cruelty. Still, memory endured in private. A Filipina survivor once said that the smell of canned peaches followed her for the rest of her life. Every time she opened a tin in later years, she would weep, not for the fruit itself, but for the absurd miracle of a soldier offering her sweetness after years of degradation. Another woman remembered the sound of a harmonica, clumsy notes played by a red-haired GI who had no idea his fumbling melody would remain lodged in her memory like a beacon. These details, fragile and almost mundane, became lifelines. They proved that even in the ruins of empire, small mercies could take root. But mercy was complicated. Some survivors confessed that the Americans' restraint had unsettled them almost as much as the Japanese soldiers' cruelty. After years of conditioning, kindness felt like a trick, a deception waiting to collapse. "I thought they were fattening us," one woman said, "like pigs before slaughter." Only when days turned into weeks without violation did the truth begin to sink in. The disbelief itself revealed how deeply the system had warped their understanding of men, power, and survival. Generations later, historians and activists would argue over the legacy of those encounters. Some emphasized the shock of the women, others the discipline of the American troops. Critics noted that U.S. soldiers were not saints elsewhere in the Pacific, pointing to cases of assault in liberated towns. The truth, as always, was complex. But within the walls of those abandoned comfort stations, in that fleeting moment of history, something undeniably different occurred. For once, uniforms had entered a room and not claimed the bodies inside it. This paradox shaped memory itself. Survivors who spoke in public often emphasized not only what the Japanese had done, but what the Americans had not done. That absence, the absence of violation, became almost as defining as the abuse that had preceded it. It was a silence that echoed louder than words. In a war filled with noise, bombs, speeches, radio broadcasts, the quiet decision not to touch carried its own weight. As the decades passed, monuments rose in Seoul, Manila, and Taipei to honor the comfort women. Bronze statues of young girls sitting solemnly in chairs faced embassies, their gazes unflinching. Tourists walked by, some indifferent, others moved. Yet few knew that behind those statues was also a story of bewildered gratitude toward a group of foreign soldiers who had once stepped into dark huts and, against every expectation, offered soap and food instead of cruelty. That layer of the story remained quieter, overshadowed by the enormity of the crime itself. Even now, the echoes remain unresolved. Survivors continue to demand recognition, apologies, reparations. Government's trade words deny, defend. But the women's voices, fragile with age, still recall that singular shock, the astonishment of finding mercy where they expected only harm. It is a reminder that history is not only about what was done, but about what was withheld, an act of restraint that became its own form of deliverance. And yet, as powerful as those memories are, they leave one question unanswered. If the women had been shocked by the Americans' refusal to harm them, what would the world do with their stories afterward? Would mercy shown in a hut ripple outward into justice, or would it vanish, leaving only silence in its place? The answer to that question would shape not just their lives, but the conscience of nations.